Hello and welcome to another gentle descent into the past. Tonight, we'll open the doors to a world once lost, now rediscovered through quiet storytelling. Perhaps you're lying still beneath the covers or letting the last hours of the day melt away. Either way, I'm honored to have you here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Are we continents apart or just a few time zones away? Both listening as the stars come out. If you enjoy resting to soft-spoken tales and thoughtful history, be sure to subscribe. There's so much more to uncover together. Medieval castles were designed with a single brutal principle in mind, to make entering them as deadly as possible. For any uninvited guest, every stone was placed, every passage carved, and every room constructed with the express purpose of channeling attackers into carefully orchestrated traps where they would meet their doom. But the truly horrifying reality is that these death traps didn't just claim the lives of enemy soldiers, they were equally lethal to the very people who called them home. The medieval world was a place where death lurked around every corner, and nowhere was this more apparent than within the supposedly safe walls of a castle. From the moment you crossed the threshold, you entered a realm where a single misstep could send you plummeting to your death, where disease festered in the damp corridors, and where the very air you breathed could carry the seeds of your destruction. Over the next several episodes, we'll explore the 12 most deadly aspects of medieval castle life. We'll discover how the grand entrance halls were designed as elaborate killing fields, how the spiral staircases became death traps for both defenders and attackers, and how the primitive sanitation systems turned these mighty fortresses into breeding grounds for the deadliest diseases known to mankind. But before we delve into the specific mechanisms of death that plagued these stone fortresses, we need to understand the world that created them. The medieval period, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th centuries, was an era defined by almost constant warfare, political instability, and technological limitations that made everyday survival a monumental challenge. In this violent world, castles emerged as the ultimate expression of military architecture. They were not built for comfort or convenience, they were built to kill. Every architectural feature, from the placement of windows to the width of doorways, was calculated to maximize defensive advantage while creating as many opportunities as possible to eliminate intruders. The first thing that strikes you about approaching a medieval castle is the deliberate intimidation factor built into its very appearance. These structures were designed to project power and inspire fear even from a distance. The massive walls, often 20 feet thick or more, weren't just defensive barriers. They were psychological weapons, designed to demoralize attackers before they even reached the gates. Take Carefully Castle in Wales, for example. Built in the 13th century, this fortress covers over 30 acres and is surrounded by an elaborate system of water defenses. The castle appears to rise directly from the lake itself, creating an almost supernatural impression of impregnable strength. This visual impact was entirely intentional. Medieval architects understood that the fear generated by their castles' appearance was often their first and most effective line of defense. But the psychological warfare began long before you reached the castle walls. The approach to any well-designed medieval fortress was a carefully choreographed journey through increasingly dangerous terrain. Roads leading to castles were deliberately constructed to force visitors into vulnerable positions, winding through marshes, along narrow causeways, or up steep hillsides where defenders could rain down death from above. The outer defenses of a castle were designed as a series of concentric death traps, each more sophisticated than the last. Beyond the main walls lay the outer ward, a deceptively open space that was actually a carefully prepared killing ground. Here, attackers would find themselves trapped between the outer palisade and the main castle walls, exposed to crossfire from multiple directions with no cover and no escape route. Medieval engineers were masters of what we might now call psychological manipulation through architecture. They understood that fear and confusion were their greatest allies in defending a castle. The layout of these fortresses was deliberately maze-like, designed to disorient and separate attacking forces while channeling them into predetermined killing zones. Consider the entrance to a typical 13th century castle. You might think that the main gate would be the most heavily fortified point, and you'd be correct, but not in the way you might expect. The gatehouse wasn't just a barrier to keep people out. It was an elaborate trap designed to capture and methodically eliminate anyone who managed to breach the outer defenses. The standard castle gatehouse was actually a complex multi-story structure that could house dozens of defenders. These weren't simple doorways with heavy doors, they were sophisticated military installations equipped with multiple layers of defensive systems. A typical gatehouse might feature a drawbridge over a water-filled moat, followed by a portcullis, a heavy iron grating that could be dropped to trap attackers, then another drawbridge over a dry moat or pit, followed by massive wooden doors reinforced with iron, and finally another portcullis. But the real genius of castle defense lay not just in these obvious barriers, but in the killing zones created between them. Imagine you're part of an attacking force that has somehow managed to lower the first drawbridge and raise the first portcullis. You rush forward into what appears to be the entrance passage, only to find yourself trapped in a narrow corridor with walls rising 30 feet on either side. Above you, defenders peer down through murder holes, openings in the ceiling through which they can drop boiling oil, molten lead, or simply large stones onto your head. The term murder hole isn't some dramatic modern invention. It's actually a translation of the medieval French mortuaire, which literally means place of murder. These openings were strategically positioned throughout castle gatehouses and corridors, creating overlapping fields of fire that made it virtually impossible for attackers to advance without suffering catastrophic casualties. Medieval castle designers had studied the art of killing with the same dedication that modern engineers study aerodynamics or structural integrity. They understood that the key to effective defense wasn't just building thick walls, it was creating situations where attackers would be forced into positions where they could be eliminated systematically and efficiently. The barbican, an outer gatehouse structure that became common in the 13th and 14th centuries, represents perhaps the pinnacle of this philosophy. A barbican was essentially a fortified funnel that forced attackers to approach the main gate along a predetermined path while being subjected to constant fire from multiple directions. The walls of a barbican were built at angles that eliminated any possibility of finding cover, while the narrow passages ensured that attacking forces would be compressed into dense formations that made them perfect targets for medieval artillery. One of the most sophisticated examples of barbican design can be found at Warwick Castle, where the approach to the main gate forces attackers to make a series of turns while being overlooked by no fewer than 6 separate defensive positions. Each turn in the path was designed to present attackers with a new threat while preventing them from seeing what lay ahead. This wasn't just military architecture, it was psychological warfare expressed in stone and mortar. The designers of these fortresses understood that an enemy's imagination could be just as effective a weapon as any sword or crossbow. By creating approaches that were clearly dangerous but whose specific threats remained hidden, they forced attackers to confront not just physical obstacles, but the constant fear of unknown perils waiting around each corner. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of medieval castle design was how these death traps affected the people who actually lived within the walls. While much attention has been paid to how castles defended against external threats, the daily reality of life inside these fortresses was often just as deadly as any siege. The same architectural features that made castles effective military installations also made them incredibly dangerous places to live. The narrow, winding staircases that confused attackers also made it easy for residents to take fatal falls, especially in the dark corridors lit only by flickering torches. The thick walls that provided protection from enemy artillery also created a damp, poorly ventilated environment that was perfect for the spread of disease. Medieval record-keeping, while not always comprehensive, provides us with glimpses of just how deadly castle life could be for its inhabitants. Chronicles from the 13th and 14th centuries are filled with accounts of nobles and servants who met their deaths through accidents that were directly related to the defensive features of their homes. Take the tragic case of William de Braos, a powerful Norman lord who fell to his death from the walls of his own castle in 1230. According to contemporary accounts, William was inspecting the defenses of Bramber Castle in Sussex when he slipped on the narrow wall and plummeted 40 feet to the courtyard below. The same battlement that had been designed to provide a secure firing position for archers became a death trap for the castle's own lord. Such accidents were far from rare. The defensive architecture that made castles formidable military installations also created countless opportunities for fatal mishaps. Spiral staircases, designed to favor right-handed defenders fighting their way down, were treacherous for anyone carrying loads or moving quickly in poor light. The narrow arrow loops that provided protected firing positions also created dangerous protrusions that could catch clothing or cause people to lose their balance. perhaps most deadly of all were the castle's sanitation systems, or rather, the lack thereof. Medieval castles were essentially self-contained cities that might house hundreds or even thousands of people during times of siege. The waste produced by this population had to go somewhere, and the solutions devised by medieval engineers, while ingenious for their time, created perfect conditions for the spread of deadly diseases. The typical castle latrine, known as a garderobe, was built into the thickness of the castle walls and discharged directly into the moat or onto the ground outside the walls. While this system had the advantage of being simple and requiring no maintenance, it also meant that the castle's water supply was constantly being contaminated by human waste. During sieges, when the castle population swelled and water sources became limited, these conditions became breeding grounds for cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century, found perfect conditions for transmission within castle walls. The crowded, poorly ventilated conditions combined with primitive sanitation and the presence of rats and fleas meant that once plague entered a castle, it could spread through the entire population within days. Contemporary accounts describe entire castle garrisons being wiped out not by enemy action, but by disease. The Chronicle of Moe Abbey records that in 1349, the great castle of Skipton was left with but 3 men alive, all others having perished of the pestilence. Similar accounts can be found throughout medieval Europe, testament to how the very features that made castles militarily effective also made them perfect environments for epidemic disease. The irony of medieval castle design becomes even more apparent when we consider how these fortresses affected the mental health of their inhabitants. The same isolation that provided security from external threats also created conditions of psychological stress that could be just as deadly as any physical danger. Medieval castles were designed to be self-sufficient during extended sieges, which meant that their inhabitants often lived in virtual isolation for months or even years at a time. The thick walls that kept enemies out also kept residents in, creating an environment that modern psychologists would recognize as profoundly unhealthy. The limited natural light that filtered through the narrow arrow slits, combined with the constant dampness and poor air circulation, created conditions that we now know contribute to depression and other mental health disorders. Medieval chronicles are filled with accounts of castle residents who suffered from what they called melancholia, a condition that often led to suicide or other self-destructive behaviors. The case of Isabella de Fortibus, Countess of Devon and Lady of the Isle of Wight, provides a particularly poignant example of how castle life could affect mental health. After inheriting several castles following her husband's death in 1262, but the architectural nightmares of medieval castles extended far beyond their defensive features. The very materials used in their construction harbored their own deadly secrets. The mortar binding those massive stone blocks together was often mixed with whatever materials were readily available. Lime, sand, and water formed the basic recipe, but desperate builders frequently added organic matter like animal hair, blood, or even human waste to strengthen the mixture. Over time, this organic material would decay, creating pockets of weakness that could cause entire sections of wall to crumble without warning. The stones themselves told their own grim tale. Quarried from local sources, they were often of inconsistent quality. Some were porous and absorbed moisture like sponges, expanding and contracting with the seasons until they cracked and split. Others contained iron deposits that would rust over time, staining the walls with streaks of red that looked disturbingly like dried blood. When these iron-rich stones finally gave way, they could send cascades of razor-sharp fragments raining down on anyone unlucky enough to be below. The wooden elements within castle walls presented their own catalog of horrors. Massive oak beams, some weighing several tons, were held in place by primitive joinery techniques and iron fittings that corroded over time. When these supports failed, they didn't fail quietly. They came crashing down with bone-crushing force, often triggered by nothing more than a strong wind or the vibrations from heavy footsteps above. The Great Hall of Kenilworth Castle still bears scars from one such collapse in the 14th century, when a supporting beam gave way during a feast, killing 12 guests instantly. But perhaps nowhere were the structural dangers more concentrated than in the castle's towers. These soaring monuments to medieval ambition were essentially vertical death traps. Their spiral staircases wound upward in an endless helical nightmare. The steps themselves were carved from stone, but decades of foot traffic had worn them smooth and treacherous. In wet weather, they became as slippery as ice. The medieval chronicler Matthew Paris recorded one particularly gruesome incident at the Tower of London, where a guard carrying a torch slipped on the rain-slick steps and tumbled down 3 full flights, his burning torch setting fire to the rushes scattered on the landing below. The narrow windows that punctuated these towers, designed to admit just enough light to see by while remaining defensible, created their own hazards. Children and small adults could easily slip through the wider arrow slits, plummeting to their deaths on the rocks below. The window seats, carved from the same stone as the walls, were positioned at exactly the wrong height to provide safety, too low to serve as proper barriers, too high to step over easily. They became stumbling blocks that sent countless castle residents tumbling backward into empty air. Even the castle's water systems, essential for survival during sieges, harbored deadly secrets. Wells were often dug so deep that their sides became unstable, collapsing without warning and entombing anyone unlucky enough to be drawing water at the time. The elaborate systems that collected rainwater from the castle's roofs became breeding grounds for mosquitoes and other disease-carrying insects. Worse still, these standing pools of water often became contaminated with the decaying corpses of birds, rats, and occasionally human remains that had fallen from the battlements above. The castle's kitchens, located in separate buildings to reduce fire risk, presented their own unique dangers. The massive fireplaces required to feed hundreds of people generated such intense heat that the stone walls around them would crack and crumble. Kitchen workers regularly suffered severe burns from exploding pottery and scalding liquids. The smoke from these fires, with nowhere to go but up through primitive chimneys, would often back up and fill the kitchen with choking fumes. More than one cook met their end by collapsing unconscious into their own cooking fires. The great halls, where castle life centered, were perhaps the most deceptively dangerous spaces of all. Their soaring timber roofs, marvels of medieval engineering, were held together by complex networks of wooden joints and iron bolts. Over time, the immense weight of these structures would cause the walls to bow outward, creating stress fractures that spider web through the stone. When these roofs finally collapsed, they did so with such force that they could punch through multiple floors below, creating vertical shafts of destruction that claimed lives throughout the castle. The floors themselves were another source of constant peril. In the finest castles, they might be covered with elaborately painted tiles, but these decorative surfaces became treacherously slippery when wet. More commonly, floors were simply packed earth covered with rushes or straw. This organic matter mixed with spilled food, human waste, and the blood from countless small injuries created a festering carpet that harbored disease and concealed dangerous obstacles. Chroniclers tell of nobles breaking their necks after tripping over refuse hidden beneath the floor coverings. Even the very furniture within these castles was designed more for display than safety. Massive wooden tables, benches, and chairs were built to last centuries, but their sheer weight made them capable of crushing anyone unfortunate enough to be caught beneath them when they toppled. The great chair in the hall at Warwick Castle, carved from a single piece of oak and weighing nearly half a ton, was said to have killed 3 earls over the course of 2 centuries, each crushed when the ancient wood finally gave way beneath them. Perhaps most insidiously dangerous were the castle's decorative elements. Tapestries hanging on stone walls might seem harmless, but they were death traps waiting to happen. Woven from wool and treated with various chemicals to preserve their colors, they were essentially enormous candles waiting for a spark. When they caught fire, they burned with terrifying speed, filling rooms with toxic smoke and creating walls of flame that blocked escape routes. The heavy metal rings and rods used to hang these tapestries frequently pulled free from crumbling mortar, sending yards of burning fabric cascading down onto anyone below. The iron braziers used to heat these vast spaces were equally treacherous. Filled with glowing charcoal or burning wood, they gave off deadly carbon monoxide in poorly ventilated rooms. Castle dwellers would simply fall asleep and never wake up, victims of an invisible killer that left no trace. The braziers themselves, standing on 3 or 4 legs, were notoriously unstable. A careless bump or a warped leg could send burning coals scattering across wooden floors or into piles of straw bedding. Even the most basic activities of daily life were fraught with danger in these stone fortresses. Climbing stairs in the dark was a nightly gamble with death. Uneven steps, low ceilings, and slippery surfaces created a perfect storm of hazards. Narrow corridors, often pitch black, forced residents to feel their way along walls that might conceal sharp projections. Loose stones or sudden openings that dropped into darkness, seasonal changes which brought relief to those living outside castle walls, only intensified the risks within. Winter ice made every surface treacherous. Spring thaws caused frozen mortar to crack and shift, weakening entire structures. In summer, the castle's iron fittings would expand in the heat, sometimes bursting through the stone that contained them. Autumn storms could send loose stones crashing down from the battlements or rip away sections of the already weakened roof. And yet, despite these dangers, medieval people continued to build and inhabit these fortresses, driven by the brutal realities of a violent age. They accepted the risks because the alternatives were often worse. A castle might be a death trap, but it was also the only refuge in a world of constant warfare and uncertainty. Ironically, the very features that made castles dangerous to their inhabitants made them formidable barriers to their enemies. The deadly kitchen, even the kitchens, the heart of castle life, were chambers of horror. Massive open hearths blazed with fire hot enough to reach over 1,000 degrees. Servants, weakened by poor nutrition and long hours, worked in choking clouds of smoke. Many collapsed from exhaustion, overcome by the heat and fumes. But the fire was only the beginning. Enormous iron cauldrons, some large enough to hold a whole pig, hung precariously over the flames. Forged generations earlier, the chains that held them would sometimes snap without warning, sending hundreds of pounds of boiling liquid crashing down. The floors, slick with grease and spills, became treacherous. A single misstep could send a servant tumbling into the fire. Wooden tables, scarred by blades and soaked with blood and juices from butchered animals, harbored dangerous bacteria. Meat hung in poorly ventilated storage, rotting until masked with expensive spices unable to disguise the pathogens within. Poisoned supplies grain was stored in damp towers or thick walls, designed to outlast a siege but perfect for rats, mice, and insects. These vermin contaminated the food supply with droppings and disease. Grain often grew mold, producing toxins that caused hallucinations, seizures, even death. Even water, the most basic necessity of life, was a hazard. Most castles drew their supply from wells dug deep into the foundation, but these were often contaminated by sewage, runoff from nearby latrines, stables, and workshops. Water tanks carved from stone or built from wood and lead became stagnant pools of algae and bacteria. Servants might skim off surface scum, but the real danger lurked beneath. Drawing water meant navigating dark, narrow staircases, slippery, steep, and worn smooth by centuries of use. One slip could send someone falling to their death. Water use reflected the castle's hierarchy. The lord and his family received the first and cleanest straw. By the time it reached the servants, the water was little more than foul-tasting, contaminated sludge. Waterborne diseases swept through castle populations regularly, sparing no one, noble or peasant alike. Perilous sleeping quarters, even sleeping was dangerous. The grand chambers of the nobility were heated by giant fireplaces that consumed wood and produced smoke and toxic fumes. Poorly designed chimneys often funneled this smoke right back into living spaces, filling rooms with deadly carbon monoxide. Beds, symbols of comfort, were anything but safe. Massive wooden frames, made from poorly seasoned timber and held together by primitive fittings, were prone to sudden collapse. Heavy curtains could catch fire from nearby candles or embers, spreading flames before anyone noticed. Mattresses, stuffed with straw or feathers, bred lice, fleas, and bedbugs, carriers of plague, typhus, and worse. With poor ventilation, toxic air, and parasitic infestations, restful sleep was almost impossible. Chronic sleep deprivation weakened immune systems and made people even more vulnerable to illness. Toxic workspace. Cascadal workshops, essential to survival, were some of the most dangerous spaces of all. Blacksmith shops, located within the walls, filled entire sections with choking smoke, deafening noise, and constant fire hazards. Forces hot enough to melt iron could ignite wood from feet away. The air was laced with toxic fumes from mercury, lead, and other metals, slowly poisoning anyone who worked there. Blacksmiths suffered from tremors, confusion, and eventually death, early victims of heavy metal poisoning. Carpenters, too, faced deadly risks. Their crude tools lacked safety features. Axes with loose heads and saws with irregular teeth often caused fatal accidents. Green or poorly seasoned wood split unpredictably. Sawdust built up, creating a fire hazard. A single spark could set the workshop and then the castle ablaze. Storage areas, Traps of their own storage areas were also architectural nightmares. Armories were packed with weapons and armor that fell without warning. Swords were stored in unstable racks that could collapse, sending blades flying. Heavy suits of armor hung from weak hooks, threatening to crush anyone below. Food stores, already disease-ridden, pose physical threats as well. Giant barrels of ale and sacks of grain were stacked high with little support, toppling onto workers without warning. Narrow halls, low ceilings, and slick floors made navigating these areas a daily gamble. A fortress of fatality. Deeper we explore castle life, the clearer it becomes. These were not romantic havens of chivalry and nobility, they were elaborate death traps. Every aspect of daily life, from cooking to sleeping to simply walking down a hall, came with a risk of death or disease, yet people endured, because in a violent and uncertain world, the castle's dangers were preferable to those that waited outside. Death sparked panic among the castle's inhabitants, who suddenly realized that any corridor, any doorway, any seemingly safe passage could harbor similar threats. The very design philosophy behind medieval castles created an environment where accidents were not just possible but inevitable. Every feature served a military purpose first, with human safety as a distant secondary concern. The narrow spiral staircases that wound through castle towers were deliberately built to favor right-handed defenders, swinging swords downward at ascending attackers. But this same design made them treacherous for everyday use, especially in the dim light of torches and oil lamps. These staircases claimed victims regularly. The steps were often uneven, worn smooth by countless feet, and slippery from moisture that seeped through the stone walls. Servants carrying heavy loads, children at play, and elderly residents all fell prey to these deadly spirals. At Conway Castle, records show that no fewer than 7 people died in stairway accidents during a single harsh winter in 1994. Their bodies discovered only when the spring thaw allowed proper searches of the castle's remote corners. The windows of medieval castles, while providing necessary light and ventilation, were designed primarily as defensive positions for archers. They were narrow on the outside to prevent enemy arrows from finding their mark, but opened wide on the interior to give defenders room to maneuver their weapons. This created deep funnel-shaped openings that were essentially unguarded precipices. Within the castle walls, children were particularly vulnerable to these window traps. The wide interior sills seemed like perfect places to sit and play, offering respite from the cramped living quarters. But one moment of carelessness, one slip or stumble, could send a child plummeting through the narrow opening to the ground far below. The pipe rolls of Henry II record payments for the burial of 3 children at KF Castle who died in such accidents during the winter of 1176. Even adults were not immune to the deadly allure of these windows. During celebrations or times of stress when wine flowed freely and judgment became impaired, castle inhabitants sometimes mistook the deceptive interior space for actual safety. The wide sill could accommodate a person easily, but the narrow exterior opening provided no barrier against a fatal fall. Many a drunken knight or servant met their end this way, their bodies discovered the next morning in the courtyard below. The defensive features known as machicolations presented yet another threat to castle dwellers. These stone projections extending from the walls allowed defenders to drop objects directly onto attackers below. But like murder holes, they created structural vulnerabilities that worsened over time. The corbels supporting these overhangs were subjected to tremendous stress from wind, weather, and their own weight. When they failed catastrophic. L'Île de Vincennes near Paris, an entire machicolation collapsed in 1367, taking with it a section of the castle wall and killing 5 people in the courtyard below. The stonework had shown no obvious signs of weakness before the collapse, leading to widespread fear among castle inhabitants about which defensive feature might fail next. This paranoia was not unfounded, as similar collapses occurred regularly throughout the medieval period. The integration of defensive systems into daily living spaces created a unique form of environmental hazard. Unlike modern buildings, where safety features are designed to protect occupants, medieval castles prioritized military effectiveness over human welfare. This meant that residents lived in constant proximity to mechanisms and structures designed for warfare, not habitation. The great halls, seemingly the safest spaces within a castle, harbored their own hidden dangers. The massive wooden beams supporting their roofs were often green timber, installed before proper seasoning. Over time, these beams would shrink, warp, and weaken. The load they carried was immense, supporting not just the roof but often additional floors and defensive positions above. When these beams failed, they didn't crack gradually but snapped suddenly, bringing down tons of timber and stone onto anyone below. Bamberg Castle experienced such a catastrophic beam failure during a feast in 1333. The Great Hall was packed, with nobles and their retinues celebrating a successful harvest when a primary support beam snapped without warning. The section of roof it supported crashed down onto the high table, killing the lord of the castle and 6 of his guests instantly. The survivors described a sound like thunder, followed by screams and the settling of debris that lasted for what seemed like hours. The heating systems in medieval castles created another layer of danger that inhabitants learned to navigate daily. The great fireplaces that provided warmth were massive affairs, designed to heat large spaces efficiently, but their size made them structurally challenging, requiring enormous chimneys and flues that created weak points in the castle walls. These chimneys were prone to blockage from debris, birds' nests, and structural settling, leading to dangerous buildups of smoke and gases within living spaces. Carbon monoxide poisoning was a silent killer in medieval castles, though it was not understood at the time. Families would simply go to sleep in their chambers and never wake up, victims of the odorless, colorless gas that accumulated when fireplaces drew poorly or chimneys became blocked. At Ludlow Castle, an entire family of minor nobles died this way in 1289, found peaceful in their beds but stone cold by morning. Such deaths were often attributed to divine will or mysterious ailments, as the true cause remained invisible and incomprehensible. The defensive ditches and moats surrounding castles created additional hazards for daily life. While they successfully deterred attackers, they also posed constant threats to castle inhabitants who needed to traverse them regularly. Medieval moats were not the clean, water-filled barriers of romantic imagination, but often stagnant, sewage-contaminated trenches that bred disease and created treacherous footing. During winter, these water features became particularly deadly. Ice would form unevenly, creating surfaces that appeared solid but could give way without warning. Many castle servants and residents fell through thin ice while attempting to cross moats or retrieve items that had fallen in. The weight of medieval clothing, especially when waterlogged, made escape from such accidents nearly impossible. Warwick Castle's records describe the drowning of a young page in 1278 who fell through the ice while attempting to retrieve a nobleman's glove that had blown into the moat. Despite the efforts of several men to rescue him, the boy's heavy woolen clothing and the shock of the freezing water prevented his escape. His body was not recovered until the spring thaw, a grim reminder of how even simple errands could turn fatal in the castle environment. The very success of a castle's defensive design often contributed to its deadliness for inhabitants. The more impregnable a fortress appeared, the more likely its residents were to develop a false sense of security about their environment. They focused on external threats while becoming complacent about the internal dangers that surrounded them daily. This psychological trap was perhaps the most insidious hazard of all, as it prevented people from taking proper precautions against the very real threats posed by their own homes. The irony was profound and tragic. These mighty fortresses, built to protect life and property from human enemies, became environments where death stalked the innocent through means both subtle and sudden. The same features that made a castle defensible made it dangerous to inhabit. The thick walls that stopped arrows trapped toxic gases. The narrow passages that hindered attackers claimed the lives of children at play. The high positions that provided strategic advantage became fatal drops for the unwary. Medieval castles were indeed death traps, but not in the way their builders intended. They were monuments to the unintended consequences of prioritizing military function over human safety, creating environments where survival required constant vigilance against threats that came not from without, but from the very stones and structures meant to provide protection. Beyond the immediate physical dangers of collapse, fire, and contamination, medieval castles subjected their residents to a host of environmental hazards that could prove just as deadly over time. The very design features that made these fortresses so formidable against enemies often created treacherous conditions for those living within their walls. During the harsh winter months, castle inhabitants faced the constant threat of hypothermia and frostbite. The massive stone walls that provided protection against siege engines also acted as thermal conductors, drawing heat away from interior spaces and creating bone-chilling cold that could kill the weak, elderly, or sick. Ice would form on interior walls, making already slippery stone surfaces even more hazardous. Servants carrying heavy loads up and down icy staircases frequently slipped and fell, suffering broken bones or worse. The narrow arrow slits and small windows that prevented enemy archers from finding targets also severely limited natural light and ventilation. During winter storms, these openings had to be shuttered completely, plunging castle interiors into near total darkness for days at a time. Residents stumbled through pitch-black corridors, falling down stairs, walking into walls, or accidentally stepping into open wells and cisterns. The lack of adequate lighting made every movement a potential death sentence. Water presented perhaps the most insidious environmental threat. Castle designers prioritized defensive considerations over drainage, creating structures that trapped moisture and humidity. Stagnant water collected in poorly designed courtyards, cellars, and defensive ditches, becoming breeding grounds for disease-carrying insects and creating treacherous patches of ice in winter. The very moats that protected castles from assault became death traps for residents who might slip and fall into the murky depths during nighttime movements or while attempting to fetch water during sieges. Medieval castle dwellers also faced the psychological torment of prolonged isolation and confinement. During extended sieges, residents could be trapped within the castle walls for months, slowly consuming dwindling food supplies while watching friends and family members sicken and die. The constant stress of potential attack, combined with overcrowded living conditions and poor sanitation, created an atmosphere of paranoia and despair that drove some inhabitants to madness or suicide. The hierarchical nature of castle society meant that lower status residents bore the brunt of these environmental hazards, while lords and ladies occupied the relatively safer upper floors of keeps. Servants and soldiers were relegated to basement chambers, guard towers, and outer buildings, where dangers multiplied. These unfortunate souls faced not only the structural risks of older, poorly maintained sections of the castle, but also the additional hazards of working in the most exposed and dangerous areas. Pest infestations added another layer of misery and danger to castle life. The thick stone walls and numerous hiding places provided perfect habitats for rats, which carried fleas infected with bubonic plague and other diseases. These rodents contaminated food stores, gnawed through wooden supports, and spread disease throughout the castle population. Medieval residents had no effective means of controlling these infestations, leaving them vulnerable to repeated waves of pestilence. The accumulation of human and animal waste within castle walls created a toxic environment that slowly poisoned inhabitants over time. Garderobes emptied into pits or chutes that often overflowed during heavy rains, sending sewage flowing through lower levels of the castle. The resulting contamination of water supplies and living spaces exposed residents to cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever. Even those who survived the immediate effects of such diseases often suffered long-term health consequences that shortened their lives significantly. Perhaps most tragically, the very features that made castles symbols of power and prestige also made them elaborate death traps for the people they were meant to protect. The massive walls that projected strength could collapse without warning. The defensive mechanisms designed to repel invaders could malfunction and kill defenders. The water systems meant to sustain life during sieges could become conduits for disease and death. In their single-minded focus on military effectiveness, medieval castle builders created structures that were fundamentally hostile to human habitation. Every design decision prioritized defense, often at the expense of the very people living within. The daily routine of castle life was itself a gauntlet of potential death. Every morning, inhabitants awoke to rooms thick with smoke from poorly ventilated fireplaces, their lungs slowly filling with toxic fumes that over years led to chronic respiratory ailments. Even the act of getting dressed posed risks. Clothing rarely washed harbored disease-carrying parasites that spread typhus and other deadly infections. Breakfast, if it could be called that, offered little reprieve. Stale bread sometimes contained ergot, a fungus that caused hallucinations, convulsions, and death. The ale served alongside was often contaminated with bacteria that caused dysentery, while water drawn from castle wells was frequently polluted by seepage from nearby latrines. In winter, when wells froze, inhabitants melted snow often tainted by animal waste and rotting matter. The architecture that made castles formidable also made them deadly. Spiral staircases, designed to favor right-handed defenders, were narrow and uneven. Worn smooth by countless feet, they became slippery death traps when wet. Many residents met their end tumbling down these stone spirals. Lady Eleanina de Montfort, in 1284, was found dead at the base of Kenilworth Castle's main staircase. Her neck snapped. William of Ashb, a young page, slipped on rain-soaked steps at Warwick Castle in 1312, his skull crushed against the stone wall. Such incidents were common. Even the great hall's symbols of power were hazards. Massive wooden beams, weakened by age and fluctuating temperatures, sometimes collapsed without warning. In 1301, a feast at Caerphilly Castle ended in tragedy, when a support beam fell, killing 3 and maiming several more. Fires posed an even greater threat. Despite being built of stone, castles were filled with flammable materials, wooden furniture, tapestries, rush-covered floors, even thatched roofs within interior courtyards. Once a fire started, it spread rapidly. The same thick stone walls that defended against armies became ovens, trapping inhabitants. At Windsor Castle in 1296, a kitchen fire ignited by dripping meat fat spread through wooden shelving and drafty passageways. 17 people died that night, including the head cook, whose charred remains were later found trapped by collapsed beams. Invisible killers lurked within the very walls. Lead poisoning was rampant among the nobility, who drank wine from lead-glazed pottery and ate food from lead-lined vessels. Symptoms: abdominal pain, confusion, and mental decline were misattributed to other causes. Many noble families suffered from the so-called wasting sickness, never realizing they were slowly poisoning themselves. Defensive features became lethal liabilities. Murder holes designed to rain death on attackers were dangerous to those above them. In 1295, Thomas the Fletcher fell through a rusted grating at Conway Castle, plummeting 30 feet to his death. Battlements and wall walks, essential for defense, claimed numerous lives. Guards slipped on wet stones or crumbled masonry. In 1294, 2 sentries at Caernarfon Castle fell when a section of the wall walk gave way, their bodies dashed on the rocks below. Water, essential for life, was often deadly. Castle wells and cisterns were easily contaminated by runoff from humans and livestock. Typhoid, cholera, and dysentery spread quickly. In 1295, an outbreak of dysentery at Harlech Castle killed nearly half the garrison. Their corpses piled up faster than they could be buried. Food storage posed lethal risks. Granaries and storerooms in lower towers were breeding grounds for rats, mold, and bacteria. In 1289, a family at Beaumaris Castle died after eating bread made from contaminated flour, their bodies convulsing in agony. Even sacred spaces became traps. Castle chapels, poorly ventilated, filled with incense, candle smoke, and exhaled breath. During Mass at Pembroke Castle in 1302, several congregants collapsed from smoke inhalation. 3 elderly residents died before they could be carried outside. Hygiene was virtually non-existent. Bathing was rare and considered unhealthy by many. Medieval physicians. When people did bathe, they often shared water, creating a stew of disease. Fleas, lice, and parasites were ever present, spreading deadly illnesses in close quarters. When injury or illness struck, help was far away. The castle's isolation and asset in wartime became a curse. Without antibiotics or surgery, minor wounds turned fatal. At Kilchurn Castle, a kitchen maid named Agnes died from an infected hand wound, something easily treatable today. Winter turned castles into freezing tombs. With little insulation, temperatures indoors barely rose above those outside. Hypothermia and frostbite were common. In 1294, 3 guards at Harlech Castle were found frozen to death at their posts, bodies stiff with cold. Even the stone could kill. Medieval mortar often contained salt-laced sand, which absorbed moisture and expanded. Over time, this loosened stones. In 1298, at Conway Castle, a dislodged ceiling stone killed Sir Hugh de Essy as he dined in the Great Hall. Domesticated animals posed their own threats. Stabled horses, essential for transport and warfare, were often confined and stressed. Attacks were common. Dogs kept for protection sometimes turned rabid, spreading disease before symptoms were recognized. The mental toll was crushing. The isolation, constant threat of attack, and grim living conditions caused widespread psychological strain. Depression, paranoia, and suicide were not uncommon. In 1299, the chaplain at Bumerus Castle recorded 3 suicides, noting they were souls driven to despair by the darkness of their earthly prison. Food poisoning was routine. Without refrigeration or proper hygiene, meat was hung for days. Salt was expensive and sparingly used. At Caernarfon Castle, a feast to celebrate new fortifications ended in disaster when guests consumed spoiled pork. 7 died over the following days. In emergencies, escape was often impossible. Heavy gates and portcullises, meant to keep enemies out, became deadly barriers. In 1305, fire broke out at Pembroke Castle. Many were trapped behind locked gates. The guards who held the keys either fled or already dead. Their screams echoed through the halls as they burned alive. Even the ground beneath castles could betray them. Unstable foundations caused walls to shift. At Caerphilly Castle, the south wall developed a dangerous lean still visible today. While slow enough to avoid casualties, other collapses came without warning, burying residents beneath tons of stone. Narrow windows blocked enemy arrows but also airflow. Poor ventilation meant toxic fumes built up. Carbon monoxide poisoning from indoor fires was a silent killer. Victims simply fell asleep and never woke again. As we've seen, medieval castles were as dangerous for those within as for the armies outside. The very features that made them strongholds turned them into lethal traps. From crumbling staircases to disease-laden air, survival behind those stone walls was a matter of resilience, luck, and sheer will. In the next part of our series, we'll explore how social hierarchy and political intrigue created human dangers within castle walls, where betrayal, revenge, and ambition could be just as deadly as fire or plague. Medieval castles, death traps hidden in plain sight. Castles subjected their residents to a host of environmental hazards that could prove just as deadly over time. The very design features that made these fortresses so formidable against enemies often created treacherous conditions for those living within their walls. During the harsh winter months, castle inhabitants faced the constant threat of hypothermia and frostbite. The massive stone walls that provided protection against siege engines also acted as thermal conductors, drawing heat away from interior spaces and creating bone-chilling cold that could kill the weak, elderly, or sick. Ice would form on interior walls, making already slippery stone surfaces even more hazardous. Servants carrying heavy loads up and down icy staircases frequently slipped and fell, suffering broken bones or worse. The narrow arrow slits and small windows, designed to keep enemy archers at bay, also severely limited natural light and ventilation. During winter storms, these openings had to be shuttered completely, plunging castle interiors into near total darkness for days at a time. Residents stumbled through pitch-black corridors, falling down stairs, walking into walls, or accidentally stepping into open wells and cisterns. The lack of adequate lighting made every movement a potential death sentence. Water presented perhaps the most insidious environmental threat. Castle designers prioritized defensive strength over proper drainage, creating structures that trapped moisture and humidity. Stagnant water collected in poorly designed courtyards, cellars, and defensive ditches, becoming breeding grounds for disease-carrying insects and creating treacherous patches of ice in winter. The very moats that protected castles from assault became death traps for residents who might slip and fall into the murky depths during nighttime movements or while attempting to fetch water during sieges. Medieval castle dwellers also faced the psychological torment of prolonged isolation and confinement. During extended sieges, residents could be trapped within the castle walls for months, slowly consuming dwindling food supplies while watching friends and family members sicken and die. The constant stress of potential attack, combined with overcrowded living conditions and poor sanitation, created an atmosphere of paranoia and despair, driving some inhabitants to madness or suicide. The hierarchical nature of castle society meant that lower status residents bore the brunt of these environmental hazards, while lords and ladies occupied the relatively safer upper floors of keeps. Servants and soldiers were relegated to basement chambers, guard towers, and outer buildings, where dangers multiplied. These unfortunate souls faced not only the structural risks of older, poorly maintained sections of the castle, but also the additional hazards of working in the most exposed and dangerous areas. Pest infestations added another layer of misery and danger to castle life. The thick stone walls and numerous hiding places provided perfect habitats for rats, which carried fleas infected with bubonic plague and other diseases. These rodents contaminated food stores, gnawed through wooden supports, and spread illness throughout the castle population. Medieval residents had no effective means of controlling such infestations, leaving them vulnerable to repeated waves of pestilence. The accumulation of human and animal waste within castle walls created a toxic environment that slowly poisoned inhabitants over time. Garderobes emptied into pits or chutes that often overflowed during heavy rains, sending sewage flowing through the lower levels of the castle. The resulting contamination of water supplies and living spaces exposed residents to cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever. Even those who survived the immediate effects of these diseases often suffered long-term health consequences that significantly shortened their lives. Perhaps most tragically, the very features that made castles symbols of power and prestige also made them elaborate death traps for the people they were meant to protect. The massive walls that projected strength could collapse without warning. Defensive mechanisms designed to repel invaders could malfunction and kill defenders. The water systems meant to sustain life during sieges could become conduits for disease and death. In their single-minded focus on military effectiveness, medieval castle builders created structures that were fundamentally hostile to human habitation. Every design decision prioritized defense at the expense of the people living inside.